Hi, this is Lynn Schnebley with Educating with Wisdom, and today I'm asking fellow Americans, especially African Americans and South African Americans, to think out of the box for a moment. Because all of the emphasis has always been in terms of African American discrimination in this continent on the United States, perhaps with the British as well. But there's very little that's being said about the Portuguese and the Spanish. And let's just take a look at what's going on here, because you're missing a great deal. You are missing what's happening with Elon Musk, the dragon, the viruses, and all the nanotechnology that's going to be pumped into you because it happened to me, and what the potential is. Let's come in and just take a look at the Atlantic slave trade for just a moment. We're not going into, because I've been critical of some of the things that African Americans have done because they helped to decimate the women's rights movement in the United States and changed it into what the misogynists wanted. And they did it with the use of Martin Luther King Jr. and a lot of African Americans as well as homosexuals. That was done deliberately, and that was a plan that was done with white men, period. You did it. And it was a deliberate plan. So let's go in and just look at the slave trade. And we have Portuguese Americans. The Portuguese Americas, almost 40%. In some cases I've seen 39%, 40%. I've seen that already. The West Indies, now that was British West Indies. That's not the United States. Here we have the Spanish, okay? The French, the British Atlantic colonies, and I guess the United States got about 6%. That does not include the horrific breeding policies that went on in this country, but as I pointed out in the Anthony Johnson versus Castor case, it was an African person himself who set forth lifetime slavery, and without that, none of these people would have come over. There is the very sick idea, and this very sick idea, that this is one of the ways that the Africans were going to colonize these areas and be able to claim them later on. There's that floating around out there as well. But let's just take a look at, so why do most African Americans live in the United States? Well, because they were treated the best here. Believe it or not, they were treated the best. The Portuguese, all right? And when you get into the Portuguese, there is like so few people in Portugal though that are actually there, left in Portugal. So when we look at the Portuguese and the Africans living in Portugal, it's like a much smaller percentage of what's going on in the United States. And yet, look at this humongous number of people. Now, the powers that be have managed to turn my camera off again. But just imagine, if you will, that this is what they've been doing. So, with that in mind, you really should be thinking of the environment and thinking out of the box here. Let's go here. Portugal. How many people? There's 10.28 million people there. Well, why aren't you suing the living daylights out of this country or some of these other countries? Why is this happening to the United States when you look at the biggest perpetrators, they died left and right with the Portuguese, and they started the slave trade. So I want us to take a look at the Portuguese and see them as being not quite as innocent and what you could be doing. Now, some of you are, again, remembering, and I'm going to bring this up again. We have a problem with the eastern part and with the Egyptian part of the slave trade because, well, the Coptic Christians helped to genitally mutilate not just women but boys, and for the slaves going into Islam and heading east. So there isn't much in terms of a population of African people when you go into these territories, because they weren't used for reproduction, and their genitals were removed if you were the man. There you go. So hundreds, I mean, they think that the Coptic priest in this area could have killed youths and young men anywhere between, what, 100? I can't remember. It was like 1 in every 10 man died in this process. But this is a long history. So it's the Nubians north and into Egypt and that whole area into Ethiopia, and they did this to men that were slaves, or I guess if you were, anyway, and the Coptic priest did it. Okay, big time. And the Christian church didn't say anything about it. So let's look at Afro-Brazilians. Here's a little piece on African Brazilians. What are we looking at? Total population. That's 7.61% of the Brazilian population. That's 2010. Maybe it's a bit more, but that's how many people there are. 7.61%. Let's go back to the African slave trade. Let's everybody take a good look at this. Take a good look at it. So let's go back now and see, because I went through and did it. Here's Portugal. Why aren't we clobbering them, and why aren't you suing the living daylights out of those people? And Europe. Well, in fact, North America has continuously gone back to Europe to save it, because they're constantly at war. And one of the things I have on the books is to consolidate our languages, because with the printing press and with nationalization, too many languages developed that were actually related, and they were codified due to the printing press. In the book of Micah, as well as Genesis 17, it strictly says that under Sarah and Sarah's kings, peoples will develop, and that is a more unified language code. That's important for the Americas if we want to move forward without having to always bail out Europe or Africa or whatever it is we're bailing out. So there are things that African Americans can be doing, and you have to think out of the box, because you could be setting up, looking after everybody by putting your foot down. And when I mean African Americans, I mean those people in Brazil as well. Portugal is 97% water. This is a speculation. What they really want is all this territory out there for mining. Now, I can't open up a picture for myself. Do you see that? They want all that territory, and it's all for mining. Now, if I look at it from an ecological Native American, or even hopefully some of the African Americans in the South and in the North that are really concerned about what's going to happen to the world, you have a few options here. Why don't you go to the World Court, and why don't we help you go to the World Court so that you can claim this territory? I mean, the Portuguese are the people that started slavery. They are the ones that got almost 40%. Everybody was competing with them. And the Vatican gave them the right to have that territory right on over through part of Brazil. So I really think you should be suing the Portuguese and the Vatican. And I think you should be looking at getting this landmass, not necessarily to develop this, but I think you should be claiming it as reparation payments for all of the hardship that the people existed, that happened to them, because it's not right next door to Portugal. And even if it was, I mean, almost 40% of the slave trade went to Portugal. And look at the small percentage of people that are sitting in Brazil. Why wouldn't you be entitled to that land? Why wouldn't you be able to help protect the land? Meaning, let your people go in and see if it's viable to actually mine anything. But, I mean, to put yourself on the map like this makes you superheroes, because you're protecting the environment. You could aggressively go out, work with the Native Americans, and protect this area from people that have done nothing but use the Americas. And I would ask you to really consider this. And I think we, the women in North America, should really look about what's happened and begin to work on these projects and say, wait a minute, Let's look at what can our African American women do in order to really make a dent in those restorations, so reparation payments, so that it can really protect the world and not just use it to produce garbage. So again, folks, let's take a look at this. Well, where are you today? Oh, you're kidding. You mean they really just sort of destroyed your lives? Okay? And let's take a look at where the money is really running. So you should be looking at those European countries. You should be looking at these other assets they're looking at getting at. And I would seriously get those assets for at least 120 years and not let them develop it. There is no reason for the Portuguese to be left off that hook. Wow. Holy smokes. What are you doing? So I went through and I covered all these different areas. I'd like you to take a look at this because the African Americans, the reasons why you haven't developed well is because of your negative karma. Your African American civil rights leaders worked with misogynistic men educated to destroy the women's rights movement. This isn't the only one I have there. There are others that are up there. When they did that, these men who were into abortions, which is Hugh Hefner and Planned Parenthood and all of these people, moved right next door and started aborting your babies left and right. Can I ask you something? And this is an important thing. Did Barack Obama and Mrs. Obama, if she is Mrs. Obama, I know because I've seen other pictures. Anyway, did they send their kids to public schools? No. For many years, I've been saying African American kids need to have the music programs. They need to have all those other kind of programs that affluent white kids have in the schools in order to get ahead. Instead, what I see happening in the state of Florida, whether it be Broward or Palm Beach County, is constant lying, cheating, conniving, scheming, even among my African American colleagues. At least they feel badly about it. But a lot of the white ones, they don't even know what, they don't even flinch. The amount of lying, double dipping in classes, the lack of real music, lack of real electives and meaningful curriculum. All of these things are lacking. Instead, we give lip service to upping African Americans. And I'm going to tell you, your African American people, whether they're in the media, whether they're your artists, they are your worst enemy. You think they're out there to help you? Oh no, they're waiting to exterminate you. They all go to the same parties with Clinton, and they go with Microsoft, and they go with the Queen, and they go with all the the bankers and the Jewish bankers and all of that. They all show up at all these places. Do they send their kids to the public schools? No. Are they whistleblowers? No. They're walking around dead cardboard. So you should really be looking at some of these other things, but pay a lot of attention to what's happening with Elon Musk, with all those satellites, all of the dragon. Come on, folks. Revelations, the book of Daniel, Isaiah 14. I mean, it's all there. That dragon is there. Let's take a look. Playboy's 1960 feminism. Please take a good look, and you will see how he set it up to destroy the feminist movement, because it didn't used to be about birth control and abortion. That got all moved around when Martin Luther King Jr. and the man who did the interview, Alex, I can't remember his name, he was a homosexual journalist. They absolutely threw everything off because they got the good housekeeping stamp of approval from African American civil rights leaders. And it destroyed your own movement. Because you equated, and I don't care how you do it, when you equate being a woman or being African with sin, you're going to run into trouble. And you appealed to the sin. All right? Please take a look and look over these things. Consider where you're going, and let's have this dialogue. Let's have this conversation, because it's time. It's time to really understand who were the perpetrators of the problem. And women that have no rights, no protection under the law, I have not. We were not your problem. I was out there advocating for you, and your own leaders weren't. They're just a oh poor me mouthpiece that are really just working for the establishment. Thank you. Have a good day.